start and share my screen. I think I've almost gotten the hang of how to do this. And then, what is that? I don't know what that is. Okay, so hopefully this will go away and I can hit play. Squeak, go away, Zoom. Yeah. All right, once the little, okay, now I can hit play, I think. That's right, yeah. Okay, we're in the right place. All right, same weekly spiel. This is LIR 219. If you are here with FCC and you're not supposed to be here, it doesn't look like any of you are. That's what we're doing, Intro to Biblical Lit. Every Monday we have 4 left. This 3 left after today. Meeting at 6 o'clock Eastern. And if you have a problem, be sure to email ilr@frederick.edu or text me at my phone number, and that way I know you have dropped off or are having some difficulty. Last week, as I said, we're going to be talking about songs, lyric wisdom. This is not a categorization that exists in the Hebrew Bible. It's something that's added later by Christians and others. And within the lyric tradition, there is Song of Songs, which we'll talk about in a moment. Psalms we'll start off with. But there's also a number of songs scattered throughout the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament that I think bears some that we might be interested in looking into. The Hebrew word, and it's different. The title of the book of Psalms is not the same, but the Hebrew word for psalm is mizmor. It implies not just praise and singing. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. Not just praise and singing, but joyful playfulness. Its root means to pluck, as in harvesting fruit. I think of when David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 6, I believe. Is that right? Yeah. He danced before the Lord, leaping with all his might in a linen ephod. And I could not help but bring in this scene from Old School, where Will Ferrell picks up his ribbon. So once now we've got that out of the way, the English inherits the Greek title for the collection of 150 songs. In Greek, it's psalmos, meaning to twitch, as in fingers upon a stringed instrument. The collection of 150 mizmor is known in Hebrew as the Tehillim, and in Greek, the psalmoi. The Book of Psalms is a collection of Hebrew prayers, poems, and hymns addressed to God or expressing some truth of God in song that do not function primarily for the teaching of doctrine or moral behavior. Scholars tend to group them into 5 books. The reason for this is that a closing benediction appears at the end of each collection, each book. It's probably a late addition to accommodate the formation of the Septuagint. And some psalms include directions for the choir master or instructions for instrumentation. They may claim authorship, and David is thought to have been a major contributor to the Psalms, as well as Solomon, but this is not actually always reliable. In general, there are a handful of different types of Psalms, with each with their own distinct function. Even though a single psalm might have multiple elements, these are the kind of the very rough kind of grouping of the types of psalm. Now we'll go through each one, and I thought we could try and guess which, oopsies, hold on, to guess which psalm it might be. So, and I'll go over them really quickly. Lament helps express grief or struggles. Thanksgiving helps express gratitude for God or to God. Praise psalms express joy about God and God's beneficence toward God's people and all the earth. Salvation history reviews God's saving history in and through Israel. Affirmation psalms are about covenant and kingship. Wisdom psalms focus particularly on wisdom and its merits. Trust psalms reiterate faith in God's goodness and care. And imprecatory psalms express anger toward God or an adversary, or enemies and adversity. So as you can see, there's a wide range of emotional content in the Psalms, and maybe some of you are familiar with one. So I've chosen one that's roughly believed to be a lament psalm, and hopefully if you know how to move the faces, you can put it up top and it's not blocking the psalm. Does anybody want to read the psalm out loud?
I'll read it.
Okay.
Lament. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him.
Thank you, Cap. Does anybody have a guess as to which psalm that is? It's known. Some of the first words are attributed to Jesus as he dies on the cross in the New Testament. It also, verse 8, evokes what happens, supposedly what happens to Jesus on the cross. There's a criminal on either side, and one says, let him deliver himself because he's blah, blah, blah. So it's really popular with Christian circles. It's not the most popular one. I'd say the most popular one is Psalm 23, but it's very close to it. Does anybody have a guess? Well, if you had guessed Psalm 22, you would have gotten it right. I've got a couple more. Does anybody else want to read the praise psalm? I can read if nobody else wants to. Praise the Lord. Praise, O servants of the Lord. Praise the name of the Lord. Blessed be the name of the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. From the rising of the sun to its setting, the name of the Lord is to be praised. The Lord is high above all nations, and his glory above the heavens. Who is like the Lord our God, who is seated on high, who looks far down on the heavens and the earth? He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit with princes, with the princes of his people. He gives the barren woman a home, making her the joyous mother of children. Praise the Lord. Does anybody have any guesses? The ash heap reminds me of Job. After he loses everything, he sits on potsherds and ash. Barren women is a recurring theme with Sarah, a number of others. This is Psalm 113. Next, we'll do a salvation history psalm. I want to include one of these because they seem kind of dry sometimes. They're retelling stories, but they do it in a way that makes them lyric wisdom as opposed to just straight narrative. Does anybody want to read this one? Bob or Amy, Jean?
I'll read. I like reading. So
okay, yeah, if nobody else is.
He sent Moses, his servant, and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They performed his signs among them and miracles in the land of Ham. He sent darkness and made the land dark. They did not rebel against his words. He turned their waters into blood and caused their fish to die. Their land swarmed with frogs, even in the chambers of their kings. He spoke, and there came swarms of flies and gnats throughout their country. He gave them hail for rain and fire and lightning bolts throughout their land. He struck down their vines and fig trees and shattered the trees of their country. He spoke, and the locusts came, young locusts without number, which devoured all the vegetation in their land and ate up all the fruit of their ground. It's a retelling of the 10 plagues of Egypt.
Right, yeah. The signs and the miracles, right. Does anybody have a guess as to which psalm it is? If you guessed 105, you would have guessed right. I've got one more, and you'll see there's some overlap. The last one I'll do is imprecatory psalms, but I wanted you, before I move forward, how even a salvation, a history psalm can serve an imprecatory purpose. Like if you're frustrated at your enemies, it might help to be reminded that God has intervened against adversaries in the past. So this next one is an imprecatory psalm. If nobody else wants to read, I guess I could, Cap, but I can just take turns. Does anybody else want to read? No? They gave me poison for food, and they gave me sour wine to drink. Let their own table before them become a snare, and when they are at peace, let it become a trap. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and make their loins tremble continually. Pour out your indignation upon them, and let your burning anger overtake them. May their camp be a desolation. Let no one dwell in their tents, for they persecute him who you have struck down, and they recount the pain of those who you have wounded. Add to them punishment upon punishment. May they have no acquittal from you. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living. Let them not be enrolled among the righteous. You may notice, again, Christians have pulled on this imagery. Jesus on the cross is given sour wine to drink, which, if you know your history, the Romans, among other things, would use a stick with essentially vinegar on a sponge to wipe their butts. And so when Jesus is given something to drink, it evokes the toilet. And that is the amount of humiliation that he's supposed to have been subjected to. But this is, again, something that might soothe its hearers when they're in a particularly difficult spot. And this is Psalm 69, or as my mom would say, who teaches grade school, it's 70 minus 1. So after Psalms, we have the Song of Songs. This is an interesting one, but I think it's important, and also helps us see what makes lyric poetry lyric in Hebrew, because Hebrew songs and poems don't rhyme. Like many languages that use gendered inflected suffixes, everything already kind of rhymes. In Spanish, for example, the suffix of a or o indicates female or male. And so those repeating sounds make it so that like everything rhymes. It doesn't make sense to not rhyme. And so in English, if you listen to rhyming poetry, that's unique to English and a handful of other languages. But in Hebrew, instead of using rhymes, the Hebrew uses doublets, which is duplicate words or repeating sounds to suggest importance and impart meaning. But the text itself doesn't really reflect it. Song of Songs doesn't really reflect lyric poetry. The title is an incipit. It stands out, however, like a sore thumb. It begins Sir Hasirim, Song of Songs, which is of Solomon, and it has its own verse. But it's almost like how the modern world has done, I've heard it referred to as versification. In order to have a conversation about where in the text something happens, we've numbered lines in the Greek or lines in the Hebrew, and those are verse. And then we group them together and we call them chapters. And if you use a number of different Christian translations, you'll even get subtitles and titles, which are not a part of the original text. On this, the first verse of Song of Songs, scholars have noticed, seems like it's added. It seems like somebody has put that there to attribute it to Solomon. And it's one of, I don't know, I tried to look, I didn't find very many, and I could be very, very misled, but it has this doublet, Sir Hasirim, but there aren't that many more. It's the perfect example of a doublet. But being poetic doesn't appear to be something that the earliest authors were interested in. Rather, there's just one thing on their mind. And I'll let you read that. I had to look very carefully for a fun, pseudo-appropriate one, and one that reflects a Song of Songs, as it talks about sexual intimacy. It incorporates imagery from nature. So the woman has flocks of sheep flowing down her head. Her teeth are like mountains, like all this weird amalgamation of nature imagery with sexual intimacy imagery. I won't go into very much detail with the Song of Songs. It's pretty straightforward. I will say, however, that Song of Songs is unique in the Hebrew Bible in that it shows almost zero interest in law or wisdom or even God. It's about sex. And you know it's good because it's in the good book. It's not called the Song of Songs for no reason, however. It's a doublet because it is thought of as the highest or greatest. And this is what these doublets do. As you force two words together, the text in Hebrew is trying to say, look, this is something more than just this one thing. It isn't just a song, it's the Song of Songs. And there are many lesser known songs peppered throughout the Bible that deserve our attention. The most important song, it could be argued, I would argue that one of the most important songs is the one found in Exodus 15. The Christian New Testament in Revelation 15:3 calls it the Song of Moses, indicating its popular attribution and much of the Torah to Moses. But the first line comes off more as a formal introduction rather than part of the earlier narrative to develop. As with the first line of the Song of Songs, it kind of sets the stage in the first verse. Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord. And then the song begins. And scholars have doubted Moses's authorship in part due to verse 20 and 21, which concludes or comes not long after the song is concluded. Miriam, the prophetess of and sister of Aaron and Moses, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sang to them. So the full version of the song, which I believe I've sent you, we'll look at in just a moment. It goes from verses 1 and 1b, the scholars will say the end of verse 1 through verse 18. So why does Miriam repeat the first line that has already been sung? Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. So we'll look at the song in just a moment. Then it has a little like, and this happened, and then it talks about Miriam, who starts it. And so scholars have some theories about this, is that the high esteem that Moses had, and this is true of literature in general, if a disciple of a really well-known figurehead writes something in that school, it will attribute that work to that person. And nobody, I won't say nobody, the point wasn't to say this person authored this, is to say, look, this is Moses represents this to us, and this is very much in the line of Moses. Now, scholars, when we want to say, okay, well, who did create this, or where does this come from? These kind of afterthoughts become more interesting to scholars, because up until that point in Exodus, there doesn't seem to have been a separation of the sexes. Like in Islam, there's a particularly conservative forms of Islam, men and women will sit separately in the mosque, and some, I don't know that is still true even in conservative Jewish synagogues. I don't know. But
it is true at Chabad. I worship at Chabad, which is an Orthodox synagogue, and there is a curtain between the men and women, and the women sit on one side and the men on the other.
Okay. Yeah, I knew that it was still happening somewhere, but at least in the text, it doesn't seem to emphasize that much. And so scholars have said, well, maybe what happened is that the oral tradition has preserved this song, and more or less they've attributed it, or they remember Miriam singing it in some way. But in canonization, where we formalize everything and we want to kind of get on the same page, someone's going to put up in the front, okay, and now, it's like a transition. A good writer doesn't just say, conclude one thought and then skip all the way to another one. You want some kind of movement. So as this song is introduced and put into the canon, you need some kind of introduction. And it's made the most sense to say that Moses did it. And then this later tradition, or the later, or somewhere in the text, it there's these weird hints that maybe there's more to the story. So some have called this the Song of Moses, and then there's the second Song of Moses, which we'll get to in a moment. Others have called this the Song of Miriam, but I think the most popular reference is usually to call it the Song of the Sea, because it happens right at the edge of the sea, where after they have after they have gone across. Oh gosh, I'm losing where I'm at. Okay, let me see if I can find it. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna pull up the Song of the Sea handout. If you have it digitally, or if you printed it, feel free to pull it out. We'll go over it a little bit together. Is this it? There we go, the Song of the Sea. Do we want to read this, or do we want to skim it and then reflect on it together as a group?
I can read it quickly if you want it read.
What other people, how are other people feeling? Have you had a chance to look at it?
Yes.
Yeah, we read it. I'm kind of an auditory listener, so I'd appreciate if somebody read it.
Okay. Cap, do you want to go ahead and read it? Do you need me to
I will
scroll, or
sing
do you
to
have
the
it with
Lord,
you?
for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea, and his chosen officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depth like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrow your adversaries. You send out your fury. It consumes them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The flood stood up in a heap. The deep congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Now the chiefs of Edom dismayed. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them because of the greatness of your arm. They are still as a stone till your people, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased. You will bring them in and plant them on your mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. Adonai Simlok Olam Voed, the Lord will reign forever and ever.
So as they're sitting, they've escaped Egypt, and the waters have parted. God tells Moses to raise your hand, let the waters collapse in on Pharaoh, and this is the song that they break out in. And you can tell that there's clearly something that was originally done, right, and preserved orally with, passed down mouth to mouth, and maybe, or I'm sorry, person to person, and maybe written down in some early form. But some of it seems to be foreshadowing something that hasn't happened in the text yet. Edom, Canaan, Philistia, none of those, at least in the terms of the story, they're not there yet. They're not having battles with Philistia or the Philistines. The land of Canaan is still kind of a far cry still. They know they're on their way there. But Edom, Canaan, Philistia, these are foreshadowing. And this is one of those things that textual critics will look at and say, there's something more in this than just, somebody didn't write it down, keep it into place, and then come back to it and put it, plug it right into Exodus. There's clearly been some editorializing. What kind of things stand out to you as you listen to it? If you think about the setting where they are, does anything kind of stand out or make you think or generating questions in your head?
I feel terrified when I hear it or read it.
And we read it at every Sabbath service. It is read by the Chazan, and 11 is done responsively by the congregation, and verse 18 is done responsively by the congregation. I've been saying this as long as I can remember as part of the services every Sabbath and every High Holy Day.
Oh, wow.
It is a standard part of the Jewish liturgy, at least it is in conservative and in Orthodox congregations.
Every week, at least every week.
Every week. Who is like your Lord among the gods?
Hmm.
And there's also the fact that it says among the gods.
Uh-oh, Richard, you muted yourself, I think.
It prestates the Israelite establishment as a fully monotheistic religion because it says among the gods as opposed to acknowledgement of God as the God, which occurs later on at Mount Horeb, Sinai, when the first of the 10 Commandments says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." So it is somewhat antithetical to the idea that later comes in of there not being any other God but the God, where Islam, Allah, is the God. That is the literal translation of Allah, a God.
Yeah.
I'm rather amazed that they're obviously making it sound very easy for the Lord God to move all this around, to blow it out of his nostrils. Yet at the same time, they keep referring to the right hand of God. What is that about?
Cap, you might know more. I know that directions can have significance. So
It's an
in parts of
anthropomorphism of God.
hold on,
It's giving God
Wait.
anthropomorphic.
Richard, just a second. So I won't talk about this here, but like in the class coming up next semester, in the marching order in Numbers 2, east is the first direction. Like you might think of like north as the first direction, north, south, east, west. But east toward the rising sun is the first direction, the most important direction. That's where Judah and Zebulon and Issachar, they face or they camp on the east side, the first side. And then I believe it goes south, north, west. And so the right hand, until we acknowledged that left-handedness was a thing, this was the hand that you did most of everything with. And this is the hand you reserved for things maybe you didn't want to do as much. And so that may be part of it. But Cap, if you have more insight, I'm really interested in hearing from you. Oh, you're still muted.
All right, what was your question again? My wife asked me something at the same time you were talking.
Oh, the right hand thing.
Yeah, there is throughout the retelling of the Exodus an anthropomorphism that is given to God, God who has no form, who is incorporeal, is given a form, and right hand is majesty and left hand is justice. There is, especially in the Song of Miriam, Song of Songs, there is a personification of the unknowable God in human terms. So in this case, you stretched out your right hand. Power is in one hand and justice and love are is in another. Each one of the extremities of God is given a specific characteristic, a human dimension. And it is done to provide to the people a concrete personification of the things that God has done for the Israelite people as they left Egypt and as Pharaoh and his chariots and his riders were thrown into the Red Sea, that the waters parted because of the blast of God's nostrils, as opposed to a wind coming up, whipping the water away. It was a way of making concrete that miraculous thing that happened that could not be understood unless you gave it a human characteristic. So this has been one of the passages that the rabbis have highlighted for years, in that it goes against the idea that you do not define God. It limits God to human capabilities when God is much more than any human.
Thanks, Cap. Does that answer your
In
question,
the
Bob?
Si-
Oh, go ahead, Amy.
In the Sistine Chapel, as I recall, they were talking about how at the right hand of God were those who were saved, and the left hand of God are those that are condemned to hell for eternity. Am I remembering that correctly from our guide's talk?
Are you asking Bob or me?
You?
Oh, I don't remember the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
The big mural, as you walk into the Sistine Chapel and you turn around, that big mural on that vertical wall. I thought that's what the guide said.
Maybe. I haven't been to the Sistine Chapel. I love its murals, but I'm sorry, I couldn't say.
Yeah,
I'm trying
that's
to
right,
think-
Amy. That's
Yes.
right. Yep.
Thank you. I don't always trust my memory.
I would note the corruption of that imagery in the Shoah, where the right hand sent you to the gas chamber and the left hand sent you to the labor camp. That imagery of right and left was a imagery that the prison guards would use in the death camps of the Holocaust to condemn people either to immediate death or to a slow lingering death.
Yeah, and also traditionally in lots of cultures, the left hand is the unclean one. So
Certainly, yeah, like the less favorable. It made me think. I'd have to look it up, but I wonder if, drawing off what you had said, Cap, I wonder if like the right is the majesty and power, and it makes me wonder, like the destroyer in Exodus and the stuff throughout Joshua and Judges. I wonder if the left hand may also be judgment. So I seem to recall that some language is around like I stretch out my hand upon my enemies, and I don't remember if it says right or left, but it seems to fit within that of like the right is good and powerful, and the left is like it's regrettable, but it's got to get done. Any closing thoughts on the Song of the Sea?
I could just continue on the left and right. Also in David's slaying Goliath, he's looking over his left shoulder, and in Italian, the left is called sinistre or sinister. So anyway, just sounds like left is not really a good thing.
Yeah, there was
not the way you want to go.
yeah, I was trying to think. There's some study, not literature or anything, but some kind of scientific study that explored, how many people are left-handed or something. And there's a big spike in the 50s. And you might be led to think that all of a sudden all these left-handers started copulating or something. But it made much more sense to recognize that the stigma about being left-handed was beginning to break down. And so once that was broken down, people who were already predisposed to being left-handed all of a sudden were able to say, the information, the data became more reliable once the stigma was removed. Anyway, so I think it's kind of fascinating that, the what culture does to preserve meaning and how that can obstruct. I don't know, it's a double-edged sword. But anyway, next we have the Song of Deborah. If the Song of the Sea occupies a central role in Israel's identity, the Song of Deborah comes in a very close second. It's technically the Song of Deborah and Barak, but the man in this place has been relegated to a supporting role. And just as before, there's like this introductory, then sang Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, on that day. So the Song of Deborah is a little bit longer. I will go ahead and read. I got to switch my share screen. Nope, Acrobat. There we go. The Song of Deborah is a bit longer, so I'll settle in and read it and we'll reflect in just a moment. It begins in Judges chapter 5. That the leaders took the lead in Israel, that the people offered themselves willingly, bless the Lord. Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes, to the Lord I will sing. I will make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens dropped. Yes, the clouds dropped water. See, there's a doublet. The mountains quaked before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord, the God of Israel. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned and travelers kept to the byways. The villagers ceased in Israel. They ceased to be until I arose. I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. When new gods were chosen, then war was in the gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel? My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly before the people. Bless the Lord. Tell of it, you who ride on white donkeys, you who sit in rich carpets, and you who walk by the way. To the sound of musicians at the watering places, there they repeat the righteous triumphs of the Lord, the righteous triumphs of his villagers in Israel. Then down to the gates march the people of the Lord. Awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake, break out in song. Arise, Barak, lead away your captives, O son of Abinoam. Then down marched the remnant of the noble. The people of the Lord marched down from me against the mighty. From Ephraim, their route, they marched down into the valley, following you, Benjamin, with your kinsmen. From Machir marched down the commanders, and from Zebulun, those who bear the lieutenant's staff. The princes of Issachar came with Deborah, and Issachar, faithful to Barak, into the valley they rushed at his heels. Among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. Why did you sit still among the sheepfolds, to hear the whistling of the flocks? Among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. A delayed doublet. You can see there's a little bit more space between those two. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan. And Dan, why did he stay with the ships? Asher sat still at the coast of the sea, staying by his landings. Zebulun is a people who risked their lives to the death. Naphtali, too, on the heights of the field. The kings came, they fought, then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They got no spoils of silver. From heaven, the stars fought. From their courses, they fought against Sisera, the enemy commander. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon. March on, my soul, with might. Then loud beat the horses' hooves with the galloping of his steeds. Curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord. Curse its inhabitants thoroughly, because they did not come to the help of the Lord, to the help of the Lord against the mighty. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a noble's bowl. She sent her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. Between her feet he sank. He fell. He lay still. Between her feet he sank. He fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. Out of the window she peered. The mother of Sisera wailed through the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? Her wisest princes answer. Indeed, she answers herself. Have they not found and divided the spoil? A womb or two for every man. Spoil of dyed materials for Sisera. Spoil of dyed materials embroidered. 2 pieces of dyed work embroidered for the neck as spoil. So may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but your friends be like the sun as he rises in his might. So you may be familiar with Judges 4, but I'm curious what kind of story you hear Judges 5 painting in verse. What does it seem as though the Song of Deborah is saying happened?
Certainly a mighty battle, right?
Yeah.
At the very
Mhm.
least.
There's more there.
Yeah, and so after the fighting, I guess, was it Jael who seemed to escape the battlefield
Mhm.
and apparently hid in a tent and was treated very well until the woman in the tent drove a tent peg through his head
Mhm.
and killed him. And then but the thing I find really interesting in this story, so that's just more of a triumph for the the Hebrews, or I'm not sure which tribe it is that we're talking about right now. But at the end, where she talks from the point of view of Sisera's mother, who's waiting for him at home thinking, well, why is it taking so long? Oh, they must be like dividing up the spoils, so everything's totally fine. So she's clueless as to the defeat that's just happened that Deborah's singing about. So I just thought that was funny. The point of view just flips,
Yeah.
you know.
So
Anyway.
maybe it's not fair to withhold what happens. In Judges 4, broadly speaking, Deborah's introduced and she's judging in Israel. There's a judge is a title that we give anachronistically to these people who seem to be charismatic leaders. They just kind of rise up when the time is needed, and then they kind of fade away when they're not. It's not hereditary. It was never politically like sanctioned. It was just, of the 12 tribes, really 13, these were the people who just kind of appeared when they were needed. And Deborah's one of them, one of the earliest. In fact, the Hebrew in this section, Judges 5, is so archaic that many scholars think that it's one of the earliest, it preserves some of the earliest elements of the Hebrew Bible. Because, and we talked about in Job later, there's some ancient phraseology, but there's others right next to it that weren't used until 7th, 6th century BCE. So it must have been closer to that more recent date. But in Judges 5, there's a lot of it and 4 that just seems really, really old. And so they think this is one of the earliest kind of, tales that they told around the campfire to preserve their history before, during the United Kingdom and the fall and the exile in Babylon. This is one of the earliest things that remained intact because of how old the language is. But as Deborah's introduced, there arises a threat in, is it Philistia? Sisera is the enemy commander. It might have been Philistia. Now I can't remember for sure. But Sisera is the threat. And so Deborah calls up Barak, and she says, you're going to lead us in battle. Barak is a Naphthalite, right? Yeah. And he's from Kadesh Naphtali, which Kadesh means holy. And so it could be that this military commander comes out of this holy city, and his tribe is Naphtali, but he comes out of the Levitical city, the city of refuge. And Barak says, I don't know, I'm not entirely sure. And so Deborah says, okay, I'll go with you. And Barak's like, I'm not gonna go without you. Deborah says, okay, but since I'm going with you, the honor will go to a woman. And so not only does Jael appear in the story, Barak, under Deborah's command, sees some success, pushes Sisera and his forces back during retreat. And Jael, who's this Kenite, her people have some treaty with Sisera's people, or they did way back when. And Sisera believes that he will be safe in Jael's tent. And Jael has, I think, married into the Israelite tribes, or there was some new treaty, I can't remember offhand. But she doesn't lie, but she also is clearly not on his side, and she lets him believe that. He goes to sleep, or he lays down, he says, bring me some milk. And as he's laying there, she drives a tent peg through his temple. And then they win. Sisera's dead. The enemy is kind of scattered. And then we see Judges 5. So what's interesting in the song and the story is the perspective. Yeah, not only does the song give us a different perspective, it's woman to woman. So Deborah's song speaks of Sisera's wife or mother coming home, or thinking is going to come home. And she asks, haven't they found and divided the spoil? And the text says she's answered her own question. They have not found and divided the spoil because Sisera's dead. And it plays on these ancient story lines, right? Of like a mother losing her child to war is something that, like, throughout human history, we can identify with that. And so Deborah, kind of the story with Jael, whose name means mountain goat, it centers the perspective of women, almost like subverting the cultural assumption that men are dominant and are the centers of the story. Like, this is one of the oldest elements of the Hebrew Bible, and it's from a woman's perspective. Barak just kind of comes in and he's like, I don't know if I can do it. So then Deborah says, okay, fine, you'll be under my command. Jael takes the honor. And then what I wanted to point out in the song, they're remembering this. And if you notice, there's some battlefield rivalry going on. And I hadn't read this through, start to finish until just a couple of months ago. And you'll notice there's the tribes that are receiving the honor and glory or whatever are Zebulun, Naphtali, and I want to say Issachar, and there's one more, maybe the Benjamites, I can't remember. But then it makes sure to point out that not all the clans helped out. Among the clans of Reuben, there was great searchings of heart. They weren't sure. They've got yellow backs, right? They had to think about it. Whereas Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, they're all to the fight, right? I think it gives the numbers for Zebulun and Naphtali of 30,000 soldiers. And Barak is a Naphthalite. But it goes on to say that Gilead, he stayed by the river. They didn't engage with the rest of us. Dan, did he stay with the ships? Asher, did he hang out by the beach, have a little Mai Tai? I don't know if you'd notice it unless you kind of get, in the military, I spent 6 years in, you do this, you make fun of one another, even when the stakes are kind of high. And so one of the things I find super compelling about this, given my history, is how that seems to be preserved in this ancient text, where clearly there's some, especially throughout Judges, there's clearly some infighting, some loss of love between the tribes. But if this is one of the oldest ones, it isn't as simple as saying that, Zebulun, Naphtali, Issachar, they're all the good guys and the other ones are the bad tribes. Judah isn't mentioned, I don't think. And so that kind of detail seems to me to be fascinating when we think about how these stories may have actually unfolded in time, and in how they were remembered by the people that inherited this story. I can get pretty long-winded. I want to mention, I should have probably said what the story was before asking y'all, but given all that, any other thoughts, reflections, feelings that come up in response to the Song of Deborah?
I felt that strongly too about the women's role in this particular piece. And I don't know if you've ever read the Gates of Fire about the Battle of Thermopylae, and finally at the end of that story, at the end of that narration, it becomes very, very clear that it's the women, the Greek women that are the Spartan women that really are the soul and the base and the part that really brings meaning and attitude toward those men that fought at the Battle of Thermopylae. So not unlike this here, but I'm sure how much difference in time, I don't know.
Yeah. And the Spartan women, I know it because that one line, come back with your shield or on it, which is a very different cultural expectation than we see here in Judges 5. Sparta was, train their men from birth to be fighters, and they lasted longer than Athens. In Israel, it's a different imagination. The women aren't, kind of pressuring the men to adhere to the cultural expectations. Instead, women are embodying the cultural expectations held by all of them, and men aren't absent by any means. And there's clearly some fulfillment of what we think of as the norm, but either the text or Israel are subverting that, or Israel and the culture that produced the Hebrew Bible just doesn't think of things the same way as we do, in modern times, or even in ancient times, like Sparta. It's like there's a lot of shame that it can be used to get people to do stuff that you want, and I don't see that as much in these kinds of disclosures of Israel's kind of imaginative stance and in its own writings. Anybody else before we go on to the Song of Moses?
It is to some degree, because we did not have a king in Israel at the time. It is to some degree an accounting of how the different tribes of Israel, after the conquering of Canaan, which was incomplete, Joshua did not follow the instructions. It is an accounting to a large degree of the roles assumed by the different tribes, and in some cases, it's almost a curse against those tribes that didn't participate. You sat by the sea. Why did you not send some troops to aid us in the effort? There's also a very feminist-looking, forward-looking section of the Bible, in that Deborah is given basically rulership over the tribes, over the armies. She is the leading general, and it is a single woman who is able to tempt the general Sisera into her tent, and when she gets him asleep, grabs a tent peg and a mallet and kills him, drives that tent peg right through his temples. So it's very much both a calling out of the tribes of Israel, an acknowledgement that it is female leadership as a general, and that it takes the wiles of women to win battles.
Yeah. Any other closing thoughts? I don't know if I sent y'all did I send y'all a handout for the Song of Moses? I'm afraid I didn't, and I'm not sure. If I didn't, that's fine. It's I don't think I did, and I can't remember exactly how long it is. But really quickly, the Song of Moses. Let me get to that. Can y'all see my screen again? I just want to make sure. Okay. So the Song of Moses, there's a Song of Moses that doesn't appear as much to be redacted, at least not in terms of authorship. It comes in Deuteronomy 32, sometimes called the second Song of Moses. It is part of his long farewell before the end of Torah and the transition into the tribal confederation that we see in Joshua and Judges. So this is before Judges. I did want to add Deborah first because the song stuff I want to do chronologically. When the Hebrew Bible was finalized, however, the Mosaic attribution was pushed to the prior chapter, to the last line of chapter 31. So before the Song of Moses, and by chapter and versification, we hear that Moses spoke the words of this song until they were finished in the ears of all the assembly of Israel. And it's really long, but it's also a retelling of what happened and what brought them here in preparation to hand off leadership to Joshua. And there's a catch, since the conclusion suggests that it might actually have been sung with his successor. At the end of the song, it says, Moses came and recited all the words of the song in the hearing of the people, he and Joshua, the son of Nun. Deuteronomy 32:44. It's a similar situation with the Song of the Sea, where clues about original authorship are obscured in order to give something greater gravitas by attributing something to the greater figurehead, Moses in this case. So what's it about? The Song of the Sea celebrated miraculous victory, and Deborah's song celebrated leadership in Israel. Moses' song celebrates, well, Moses. The first three verses reiterate his leadership before going into the history of Israel to that point, and then also including warnings against violating their covenant with God. And it really is almost not a word for word, but like it's just telling this story. Moses is reminding the people on the plains of Moab before Joshua takes the reins. They cross the river Jordan, they reenact Passover, they circumcise all the men who had been born in the wilderness, and then they go off and they're going to take Jericho. But the story or the pattern is cyclical. We make some progress and we remember where we came from. We make some more progress, we remember where we came from. And that is the reason that Moses gives this rehash of what happens. And his song, it's maybe it's written by him, but it's just as likely that it was written by somebody else in memory, almost like a eulogy of, or eulogy for Moses. So we'll also talk, we have two more songs that I wanted to share. The next one is the Song of Hannah. And you'll see here, the last couple of songs, Christians have noticed patterns in and have drawn into the New Testament. And so I use brown for me to remember Hebrew, green for Greek, and I use red for Latin, and you'll see that in a moment. So if you see that, that's why I'm indicating which language we're talking about. The Greek Septuagint, obviously, is, we have the earliest complete manuscripts, and then Hebrew we have later but reliable manuscripts, and then finally Latin, the Vulgate, I'll talk about in a moment. Some songs serve to propagate character types in the Bible, like the barren woman seeking a child. Sarah is the most central, and the trope is reinforced with Hannah in the opening chapters of the books of Samuel. A woman troubled in spirit, so it begins. Hannah is the barren but favored wife of Elkanah, the Ephrathite, which is a way of indicating that someone's from Bethlehem. The Ephrathites are people who are from or living in Bethlehem, which is also the city of David. Like Hagar, Hannah is tormented by his other wife. But in her case, in Hannah's case, it is the lowly woman's womb that has not been fruitful. So Hagar was a servant, of low estate, and her womb was fruitful. Ishmael was the oldest heir of Abraham. But in Hannah's case, she's favored, but she's barren. And the husband seems genuinely like a good person. He says, aren't I better than 10 sons? And he treats her really well. But the cultural kind of pressure is you're supposed to have children in order to be fully human, if you're a woman. She prays to be given a child whom she promises to dedicate to priestly service. She eventually conceives and bears the prophet and judge Samuel, who she leaves with the high priest Eli as a loan to the Lord. She says, I have lent him to the Lord. It's kind of this interesting little tidbit that I've not seen repeated in the Bible. Chapter 2 opens with her song of thanksgiving. The Hebrew incipit would be alas, my heart alas in Jehovah, my horn is room in Jehovah, my mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your Yeshua, your salvation. And the Greek hypsu also means to heighten. And let me pull that up. I did send that one out, and I actually really, I really like the Song of Deborah. Let me see, where am I? Share screen, back to Acrobat. I can double click, there we go. All right, the Song of Hannah. And I've put it alongside the Song of Mary, which we'll get to in just a moment. Does anybody want to read? Maybe a woman singing, reading and singing in a woman's voice? You don't have to sing. Jean, Amy, do you want to read? You can say no.
Sure, I'll read.
Okay, Amy.
My heart in the Lord, my caress in the Lord, my mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for the bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on him he has set the world. He will guard the feet, excuse me, he will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness, for not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed.
Thank you, Amy. I forgot to point out Hoopsu and Keros. I should have left in, but my heart exalts in the Lord. My soul is heightened or strengthened in the Lord. And then I meant to do something in salvation, but what do people, how does that song hit people? Like, what is going on, and what do you notice anything that might stand out to anybody? I should say in verse 6, Sheol is roughly, you could think of it as hell, but it's not exactly the same thing. And they've left that untranslated in, I think this is the ESV. I did think that verse 9, for not by might shall a man prevail. I thought that was, yeah, it's just,
I guess what I get out of it is just the power of God.
yeah. And I think there's a tradition that states that Hannah eventually had 6 more children. And so when she speaks of the barren, she may be speaking of herself in contrast to her other, I don't know, her sister wife, I don't know what they could call them, who had many children and who tormented her. Well, I coupled this with the Song of Mary for a specific reason. It seems as though Mary's song in the New Testament really seems to borrow from Hannah's song. And so I'll click through here again, and you'll notice in the image, this image is, oh, it's a woodcut, but it's not Gustave Doré. My favorite, as you've probably seen, is Gustave Doré. You can think of him as like the original graphic artist. And so the image is Doré's from his Tours Bible. And it's very similar to Hannah's posture. And in the background, that's Eli. So part of the story that I didn't talk about, Hannah goes to the temple with her husband every year to make sacrifice. And in a prior year, she went there and she's praying silently, and her lips are moving. And Eli, the priest there in the background, thinks she's drunk. And she says, I haven't had anything to drink. I'm just praying. And she comes back later after she's conceived, and Eli sees her. And Hannah says, oh, here's my child. As soon as I wean him, he's going to come live with you because I've dedicated him to the service of the Lord. And so that's Eli in the back looking on her and wondering if she's drunk. And I thought it was interesting that the posture seems very similar to Gustave Doré, who would have been, he was doing his stuff in the 1800s. I think the prior woodcut is a little bit older. I'm not sure. So this brings us into the New Testament a little bit. And Christians prefer to call songs, I don't know why, they prefer to call them canticles. So the Canticle of Mary is one of the more popular ones, sung by a Parthenos, which means a young, innocent woman. Some people have inferred that means a virgin sexually, but that isn't really, that's a little too precise for the original context. There was no, were you a virgin but not married? It was like, if you're married, you're not a virgin. And it didn't have as much to do with sexual intimacy. But Parthenos in Greek and later in Latin, I can't remember what it is, there was hints of that because there were unmarried women like temple prostitutes at some temples. So there's that mixing of language, whereas in Hebrew and the Israelite kind of imagination, if you weren't married, you didn't have sex. And if you didn't have sex, you weren't married. It was just kind of cut and dry, or more cut and dry. But in Greek and Latin kind of language and imagination, there was more give and take. And so you could be not married, but having sex, and you might be having sex and not be married, or both. And so the Parthenos, the use of the Greek language, kind of muddles the water a little bit. Mary was young and chaste, but it isn't supposed to definitively mean she had or had not had sex. We see her in the first chapter of Luke's gospel, and you may have heard of this canticle by its Latin name, the Magnificat, which is an incipit, but it's not. It's from Jerome's. Well, let me pause on that. The high church traditions of the West, Catholic, Anglican, they draw their incipits from Jerome's 5th century Latin Vulgate. And his work is known as the Vulgate because it's from the Latin vulgus, which means common or low. In Jerome's time, if you were rich and popular, you spoke Greek and you were in Rome speaking Latin, but a lot of people by the 5th century began speaking Latin, not necessarily reading it, but it was considered a vulgar language because everybody spoke it. It's like Aramaic in 1st century Palestine. It doesn't mean dirty. That's a later kind of imposition of a connotation that the original language didn't have. Mary would love that, the low status of the vulgus or vulgate, since humility is a recurring theme in her song, coming up in the 1st and 7th verses. It also recalls the magnification evoked by Hannah, Samuel's mother, and the violent overthrow of oppressors in the Song of the Sea. That's important since her name in Greek is the same name as Moses's older sister. And it's possible composer, not Mary, but Miriam, the prophetess. The original Aramaic speaking audience would have heard on her lips the name she is to give the child. Savior and salvation is soter in Greek and Yeshua in Hebrew and Aramaic. The exact same name is also the title of the 6th book of the Bible in Greek, anglicized Joshua or Jesus. According to the New Testament, this is the name of God on earth is Joshua, meaning salvation or savior. You shall call his name, in Greek, it's Jesus, which is Joshua, the 6th book of the Bible. But Aramaic, the original audience would have heard Gabriel, or Mary would have heard Gabriel say Yeshua, which means salvation. And so let me go to that handout again. See if I can find it. And this is, it's why I really like comparing it next to Hannah, because so much of it seems so similar. And since I changed some of the language, I'll go ahead and read it myself. My pasuke, my soul, magnifies the Lord, and my spirit, my pneuma, agialio, exalts in God my Savior, Yeshua. For he has looked on the tapainosis, the humility, the humble estate of his servant. For behold, from now on all generations will call me blessed, makarizo. For he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. And his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. The doublet there, remember? He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his offspring forever. So what do we hear in Mary's song? What does she see God doing in the world in announcing to her that she's going to bear this anointed one? What do people think when hearing Mary's Magnificat?
Well, like before, he's going to raise up the lowly and keep the high people from having all their power, I guess.
Yeah, frustrating the systems of power that elevate some and humiliate others. And it's a lot of it is in the past tense in Greek. That in doing so, Christians believe that when Gabriel makes this annunciation, that it's already been set in motion. It's fated, right? It's already been done. That in Mary's, in Mary being told and affirming that she is going to bear Yeshua, salvation, God's son, that this thing has already happened, that it is happening even as she is singing this song. And like the song of Hannah, like the song of the sea, there's this reversal of power, right? The mountains will be made low, the valleys will be raised up, the humble will be exalted, the hungry will be fed, and everybody else is going to get the things that they kept from others, right? There are other sections of the Bible, especially the New Testament, that talk about that, the Beatitudes. But Mary's Magnificat seems to have this, it's not violent, but there's something that God is doing that people aren't going to enjoy, but that is right on behalf of the poor, like her, of humble stature. And what salvation seems to entail is this reversal of corrupted power here on earth, right? The proud will be scattered. The mercy, or God's mercy, is for those who fear him throughout all time. And so before I go on, I wanted to press or ask one more time do people see a common thread? I've chosen these songs. There's others. You could talk about the Song of Hezekiah. You could talk about, there's a Song of Jeremiah. There's a number of them. But as Cap, I think Cap is eating. But like the Song of the Sea is repeated every week in Jewish services. The Magnificat is at least annually, if not several times, or once every several months. It's a pretty popular hymn, and you can see how it doubles sometimes. It's written in Greek, not in Hebrew, so it's again this kind of mashup of Hebrew Greek sentiments, or I've been calling it imagination.
Yeah, rather aggressive egalitarianism that God's trying to accomplish, and it doesn't seem to matter, how you got to where you are. He's going to bring you down to the level or up to the level to make everyone essentially even. And these two, at least, I'm not doing all the three that you had sent, but in these two, at least, there's an active, aggressive egalitarianism that doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, I like that, aggressive egalitarian. And it seems as though the unspoken indictment is that we, humanity and Israel, have failed to do this, right? If you remember in Genesis, we're created good. This egalitarianism has been there from the beginning. We're created good. The youngest are typically exalted, right? David is the youngest of 8. Samuel is the oldest, but he's kind of rare. Moses is younger than Miriam and Aaron. And so the human systems in place that consolidate power unjustly, Israel and Christians would say they've inherited this calling of, like Bob said, aggressive egalitarianism. What does it look like to make right the things that are not right? To topple, the towers and the unjust power that we have this habit, macro level humanity, we have this pattern, we have this habit of adhering to. And so every so often God, it seems as though the Bible is saying every so often God's going to come in and, tweak it, right, to correct it. But aggressive egalitarianism, I think that's certainly what I see.
One other thing, this just struck me all the way through all of these songs and many of the other biblical passages that we've looked at, is that it's very aggressive finality, that we're getting here. And so, for instance, in the Magnificat, it says, and his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. And so it's all very much on, this fear and trembling, on the part of humans, and God's power and willingness to use it. But then I think, as I was reading this, I was thinking of John 3:16, for God so loved the world. This is the way God's showing love in the songs that we've been seeing. Is very different from what, I guess, the more Hellenized version of what comes in other gospels. I think Hellenizing,
I felt much more at peace. I felt much less unsettled with the Bible once I started to kind of be able to see where the salt water meets the fresh water, right? Where Hebrew and Greek and I can kind of imagine where there might be some corruptions, and it allows me to sit with a text more comfortably, not in a good way, knowing that, or I'll say that I think one of the most pernicious distractions in I'll say in Christian faith communities is this idea of inerrancy, that the Bible is like, it's right there, right? John 3:16,
Yeah.
or
Context is
Exodus
everything.
15:3, God is a man of war. And that's not what the Bible ever proposed itself to be.
Mhm.
It is like if I was thinking about this today, like if you were to have something like the Bible in kind of contemporary terms, part of it would be like a graphic novel, part of it would be like a penthouse letter, like Song of Songs. Like this is not of a cut all from the same cloth in the way that we think of cloth, right? Like if there's some, not uniformity, but if there's some common thread, it's something that's going to be very foreign to us. So like love, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. On the one hand, that does sound, yeah, that's incredible. Like Abraham, that Christians believe that Abraham's attempted or near sacrifice of his son prefigures Jesus Christ and God the Father. And from that seems like really messed up, but there's that little thing, right? Like we talk about sacrifice in military terms, like that's a good thing. Jumping on a grenade, that is a good thing. And yet it's deeply tragic. And these two things are held together. And I think being in the military has helped me kind of hold these things in tension. Like the grenade analogy is one I've been kind of tumbling around in my head recently. It's like, it's really messed up that has to happen. And yet I can see how that is good. Like given the system that we have, given the world that we've been a part of creating, what we think of as goodness is no longer so stark, right? You have to find the shades of gray amidst all of these different threads, right? And so when we want to reduce the Bible to one thing by saying, well, the Bible's inerrant, God wrote it. I remember childhood friends who literally think the finger of God, like wrote it. And I think there's adults who think that. And that's just not what the Bible is. That doesn't seem to be what the Bible wants us to think. And the more I get into this, the more I'm given the opportunity to teach classes, to read, and have the responsibility to lead these kinds of conversations. It's allowed me to look a little bit more, look more deeply and seek more deeply to try and find kind of what can we pull out of this. So with that, let me conclude with a final brief exercise. Let me pull it back up. So, like other literary devices in the Bible, songs are used to evoke and then echo back the story of God back upon itself. Not a snake eating its own tail, but a circuitous story orbiting around Yahweh. Hannah, married to a man of Bethlehem, prefigures Mary, who will give birth in Bethlehem. Her Hebrew name, Miriam, calls us back to Moses and the Nile, just as her son's name, Yehoshua, recalls the work of God in salvation. The reason for Hannah's rejoice. The Israelite lyric wisdom tradition features female leadership prominently, from Hannah and Miriam to Deborah and Jael. It matters who composed these songs, but not the way you might think. Did a historical Hannah write out her prayer? Then King David fill it out and have Solomon put it in his collection of songs? Almost certainly not. nor did God reach his finger down and finger jam the Bible like you sign on the digital terminal after you buy your morning coffee. However, neither did one person, man or woman, sit down and type out these texts like I do my lessons for y'all. These women and men probably did have a hand in their composition, but to think theirs were the only hands in the pot is misleading. The Bible, Hebrew and Christian alike, was born in and transmitted through community rather than isolation. I bring up Psalm 113 and I put it in the handout because it's lifted almost line for line. Did Hannah write Psalm 113 or did she draw from it as a source? Like, yes and yes, probably. I mean, this is circuitous. As what Hannah prayed was preserved and remembered by a human community, it was then transcribed and preserved in what we call Psalm 113. She wouldn't have, there was no numbers that we had it, at least not until after Hannah. And this makes me think in the very beginning of Genesis, there's one thing that God calls not good, and it's bad. I may be mispronouncing it. Cap, you might correct me, but bad is isolation. The only thing that's called not good is that humanity be alone. And so we can't come to the text alone thinking that we have everything we need. We have to call in the writers of the Septuagint and the composers of the New Testament, the canonizers in the 3rd century BCE. Biblical literature is about community, a reading community, a composing community. But that is, I think that's really what it's about. It's a community of people making meaning in a world that has lost sight often of what it means to be good. And I said this before, I'll probably keep saying it. The Bible, I think, helps us see what God sees as good and reminds us how to live lives that will not necessarily give us what we want, but will give us what we need to be connected with one another so that we are not bad, but we reflect our own created nature, which is to be good. I have 4 minutes on my clock until our time is up, so I wanted to open up briefly to discussion. I want to respect people's time. If there's no comments, that's fine, but yeah, let me get off my soapbox.
I appreciate your comments because yes, I always believe that context is everything, and you have to understand who's talking to whom and when and what are the circumstances in order to really get the message of the Bible. So I have a hard time too with biblical literalists, I guess I would say.
It is often said that, especially when you look at the synoptics, that there was another book that was lost to history between the time of the synoptics, beginning in 70 of the Common Era, and that as each one was written, a copy of the previous books was there on the table when the new version was written in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Same thing can be said about the Hebrew Bible, in that if you look at the theory that there are at least 4 authors, J, P, E, and D, you would have to think that each one of them, editing and writing at different periods, had the work of others, had the work of the previous authors there in front of them as they put together their specific account that worked to illuminate their thoughts. The priestly account of the Bible and the Deuteronomist are not necessarily what the Yahwist or the Elohist accounts would be. And there are versions of the Bible that try and call forth which author wrote which portions. So the fact that you see particular phrases and particular things repeated throughout seems to me to be simply that the editors, looking at what was previously written, decided not to reinvent the wheel. This sounds good. I'm going to emphasize it in my account as I fill in the details that occur to me. because much of the Bible was an oral tradition. And it was only when we started losing our scholars to war and to death that we started writing some of this stuff down in order to preserve the learning so it would not disappear. And then we were told by the scribes that it was time to start teaching this to the people, reading it, so that the people would understand it, and creating a tradition that said that it had to be read, that we do a cycle of reading the Torah every year, reading each week a portion of the Torah, and then a parsha, an explanation and a thought about that particular portion for the week. So it is interesting how you were able to bring out these different repeating passages, and I appreciate you doing that, Logan.
Thank you. Any other concluding thoughts?
I couldn't help but think that there's so much in all this. There's so much reduction in free will that occurs in the passage that we were reading today, that or even to the point of Mary being with child, that the angel comes and tells her you're with child, and but the free will seems to be taken away. And yet toward the end, when you're talking about goodness and community and or throwing yourself on the grenade, what greater good is that for your fellow man than doing something like that? But the readings that I see that we've gone over just seems like there's a total reduction of free will. God's doing it this way, and all the rest of you be damned, or all the rest of you be risen up.
Yeah, there's a complicated relationship that faith communities have with free will. And I think that's in part a manifestation of the struggle of like, well, if I'm not God, what does that mean that I'm not God? What does it mean to subordinate our will and perhaps our desires to a greater good? Mary, I think it's in Luke. I didn't check, but I should have. She says, "Let it be with me according to your will." And that's why she's celebrated, because she's humbling herself. I got in trouble. It wasn't trouble, but I remember when I was teaching undergrads at Duke, graduate students, I made some comment that, and it's based on this, you've seen my interpretation of these songs and other stuff. And I said something like, I think women are going to get into heaven before me, and I'm just fine with that. Like, I think we can look to women to understand like virtue. And I said something about humility. And a student raised her hand, a very intelligent student. She pointed out, like, that's kind of problematic. And there's a very fine line, just like John 3:16, the sacrifice. What does it mean? Will is like, can it be forced? Like, was Mary forced? Did she have a choice? And these are important questions. All we know from the text is that she seems to have taken the agency to say, yep, that's fine. I'll do that. It doesn't have to be about me. Let it be with me according to your will. And as a student of like philosophy too, like the Enlightenment and the movement away from the dogmatization of the church, it calls up in us this, I think, reticence to kind of be subordinated to the masses, right? That can we trust other people to do thinking for us? And one of the things that this coming from a grunt, right? I spent 6 years, I'd forced to be an NCO. Like, I wasn't about to be in a leadership position. I was just fine taking orders. And there's a certain, I think there's a certain beauty in genuinely having the choice and choosing to be maybe not a follower, but to not be the person with their hand on the wheel. And I don't know, that's my two piece. I think, I think it is a conversation that I don't think is easily reducible to either or, like God forced it on her. Or we talked about Pharaoh before, right? It's true. It says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. He doesn't have the agency. But in almost as many passages, it said that Pharaoh chose to do this thing. And I think the Bible wants us to kind of move away from these easy, simple things and get deep with this complicated relationship that humanity has with God. Cap, I see your hand up, and we're up on time, but I wanted to
Just
hear what you
a
had to
quick
say.
point that if the story begins with Mary accepting that this can happen and she's okay with it, it ends with the figure of Christ on the cross saying the same thing, repeating, into my hands I commit my spirit. It's by your will.
Yeah.
So mothers teach their children.
Yeah. Those are some incredible parting thoughts. Next week, we are going to be talking about gospel, which is a unique form of narrative. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what Cap spoke of, the kind of the New Testament version of the documentary hypothesis, the synoptics, and how they took shape. And we will be meeting the same bat time, same bat channel. Thank you all for joining me, and I'll see you all in a week.
Thanks as always. Have a good evening, everyone, and happy Thanksgiving to one and all.